On April 26, 1986, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, an explosion occurred in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This disaster constitutes the worst nuclear accident in history to this day. It shook the world and had dramatic consequences for the nuclear industry. Today, everybody has heard about the Chernobyl accident because of how much it has been mediatized. The emphasis by the media on the long-term side effects of radioactivity led to an increasing hostility and fear among the general population against nuclear power. Chernobyl has appeared in numerous pieces of popular media, usually as a scary background showing the horrors of the accident. Thus, despite the accident being extremely well known, few people knew the details of what really happened until the Chernobyl HBO miniseries. The critically acclaimed Chernobyl HBO series, directed by Craig Mazin, was released in 2019. Its realistic take of the accident, combined with unquestionable cinematographic qualities and an immersive historical setting, made it an absolute success. Because of the show's popularity, the public's perception of the accident mainly comes from how it chose to depict the disaster, as well as the people involved in it. For instance, a few years ago, few people knew who Legasov or Dyatlov were. Since the show has decisively impacted the public's conception of the event, one could hope that the description of the accident was based on well-proven historical facts. However, the HBO show is a clear example of flawed historical research, distortion of facts, and sensationalization of events in order to easily seduce the audience. Not only that, but the series hugely misrepresents, unjustly blames, and tarnishes the honor of several people who were involved and died as a result of the accident. For those of you who became passionate about the Chernobyl disaster, we invite you to discover the many things you were convinced were true but were in fact misrepresented in the series. The series showed really well how flawed the reactor was, and how this bad design played a role in the Chernobyl accident. However, the series also suggests that the design was not solely responsible for the accident, and that the operators were responsible for the accident as well by making mistakes. Typically, we can see the operators panicking, shouting, and making what the show presents as security violations when controlling the reactor, leading it to an unstable state. Craig Mazin, the creator and writer of the series, insists on how this depiction of the operators' actions on the night of the accident is accurate. Not simply accurate, but accurate to the second.
The good news for those of you who love accuracy as I do is that all of the descriptions of what happened that night, all of them, are absolutely accurate down to the times.
Unfortunately, despite his assurance, that is just not the case. As of today, there is a consensus in the scientific community that operators were not at fault during the accident. This has been established in several scientific reports, such as in the 1992 report by the International Nuclear Safety Group, for instance, or in the 1991 report by the Commission to the USSR State Committee for the Supervision of Safety in Industry and Nuclear Power.
The Commission considers that the negative properties of this type of reactor are likely to predetermine the inevitability of emergency situations, and that they certainly do not demonstrate that such situations are likely to be extremely rare and would occur only in the event of an extremely improbable combination of reactor operating procedures and conditions adopted by the unit personnel.
The Soviet authorities blamed the operators for the accident to hide its real cause. This real cause was, of course, the design flaws of the RBMK reactor. This view of the facts where operators are responsible for the accident was relayed in the 1986 Vienna meeting and later on in the INSAG-1 report. This inspired many books that eventually anchored the fault of the operators in popular belief, especially The Truth About Chernobyl by Grigory Medvedev. This book invented various myths about the accident, which we will debunk later, and its lies have persisted until today, and is unfortunately one of Craig Mazin's main sources. Indeed, the USSR couldn't fault the reactor's design on the international scene, since it would have been a terrible blow for their project to sell RBMK reactors abroad. Thus, the Soviet authorities accused the operators of 6 security violations that had allegedly led to the accident. Ironically, the HBO show presents those same supposed operator violations, thus repeating ad verbatim the official Soviet stance. In reality, among these 6 security violations, only one of them was violated by the operators, as stated in the INSAG-7 report. This security violation concerns the operating reactivity margin, or ORM, which is more or less the number of control rods remaining in the reactor core. Remember, those rods control the nuclear reaction. In the series, Dyatlov orders the operators to raise the power by pulling out the control rods. Operators are pictured doing so reluctantly, and Legasov presents it later on in the show as a blatant security hazard. Nevertheless, the INSAG-7 report states that despite this violation, the operators could not know they were under the ORM limit, since the ORM value was calculated by the Scala computer, which took some time. We can also check what Boris Stolyarchuk, an operator who survived the accident, says in this 2021 interview.
В документе главный конструктор нас не предупредил. Это как пример об особой опасности малого оперативного запаса, работы при этом на низкой мощности и так далее, и так далее. Просто вот, не было никаких предупреждений. То, что было, это все в соответствии с существующей на то время эксплуатационной документацией.
As for the other 5 violations, they are plainly wrong and come from the Soviet lies during the trial. Unfortunately, the show blames the operators for some of these mistakes. For instance, the series states that operation at 200 megawatt was forbidden by the operating rules.
We have to shut all the way down, to shut down like 24 hours.
No, we're doing the test tonight. Raise power to 700.
We can't raise the power from here for rules.
But this is false, as shown by INSAG-7.
The statement made in INSAG-1 that continuous operation below 700 megawatt is forbidden by normal safety procedures was based on oral statements made by Soviet experts during the week following the Vienna meeting. In fact, sustained operation of the reactor at a power level below 700 megawatt was not prescribed, either in design, in regulatory limitations, or in operating instructions.
It is also said in the series that the operators had disabled the safety systems.
The control rods are out. The emergency system has been disconnected. The only thing keeping the reactor in check is water and xenon.
However, whether it was the emergency core cooling system, ECCS, or the turbo generator trip signal, both were permitted according to the INSAG-7 report.
Blocking of the ECCS was in fact permissible at Chernobyl if authorized by the chief engineer, and this authorization was given for the tests leading up to the accident and was even an approved step in the test procedure. This trip was blocked in accordance with operation procedures and test procedures. This trip would have saved the reactor seems not to be valid.
It is important to note that, even if the operators had kept these safety systems, none would have prevented the accident. Another thing that is blatantly false in the series is when they show that the operators follow crossed-out instructions.
Just looking at the instructions now. Are we supposed to do those or not?
There is no evidence of this, and it wasn't even mentioned at the trial, which would have suited the prosecution. This comes from an excerpt of Legasov's tapes, tape 2B to be precise, where he talks about cross-out instructions in a paper, but it didn't concern the test or the control room operators. In the 2021 interview of Boris Stolyarchuk, he's asked about it, and look what he says.
А закреслення були?
Не було, я не бачив.
Дякую.
We could say that the HBO series tarnished the image of the operators by accusing them of violations they didn't commit. However, if there is one person who was slandered above any other, it is Anatoly Dyatlov, who was supervising the test. He is today well remembered with famous memes such as "not great, not terrible" or 3.6 Roentgens. He's pictured overall in the series as a terrible boss that shouts and threatens his subordinates.
So if I say it's safe, and if the two of you disagree, then you don't have to work here, and you won't. But not just here, you won't work at Kursk or Ignalina or Leningrad or Novovoronezh, you won't work anywhere ever again. I'll see to it. I think you know I will see to it.
In his book How It Was, Dyatlov himself recognizes that he was an exigent boss. However, the little tyrant and careerist presented in the TV series is a pure fabrication of Mazin's imagination that comes from some of his flawed sources, particularly from Medvedev's book. Indeed, the TV series presents a version of the fact that was invented by Medvedev and contradicts the testimony of several eyewitnesses. In episode 5, we see Dyatlov forcing his subordinates to raise the power and shouting at them. According to the operators present at that time, it never happened.
Before the accident, I did not hear any words spoken with raised voices, only instructions related to the execution of the test program. I did not see anything resembling an attempt to replace Toptunov, nor any pressure exerted by Dyatlov on Akimov or Toptunov, supposedly for refusing to raise power after the drop, nor any displeasure related to this drop. I believe that such a conflictive situation in the control room could not have passed unnoticed.
Before the accident, there were no discussions with raised voices among the operational personnel, as well as no displeasure voiced over the drop in power. I did not notice anything that could be interpreted as disagreement regarding the increase in power.
In fact, the only aggressive behavior Dyatlov showed that night, from what we know, was shouting at Akimov at the start of the shift, telling him to hurry up and focus on the test, according to Razim Davletbayev's testimony from the turbine division. He never threatened to fire Akimov nor Toptunov from their jobs. Contrary to the cold and careless character he has in the show, in real life, Dyatlov was very affected by Toptunov and Akimov deaths, which he tried to prevent by telling them to go home once the accident happened, in order to avoid them taking a lethal dose. He wrote a letter to their parents afterwards, telling them that their sons were heroes and innocent of the crimes they had been accused of by the authorities, since the Soviet government wanted to prosecute them before they died, like they prosecuted Dyatlov. As he says in his book, he never tried to shift the blame on the operators.
There was no discussion about anyone's fault, neither on the 26th of April nor a few days later, at least around me. We just tried to understand what really happened. Kovalenko, Reactor 4 supervisor, said he had heard Akimov words in hospital. It was mainly our fault. We pressed AZ5 too late. Sasha was wrong. It wasn't the cause. Personnel didn't make fatal mistakes. It's terribly sad that boys died with an undeserved sense of guilt. Leonid Toptunov really couldn't do anything in his position, but his behavior when he returned to the unit was a model of loyalty to the matter. Alexander Akimov was a good, exceptional, and conscientious worker. He died a worthy man.
Toptunov called it out, Akimov pressed it. It was the only good decision they made, incompetent morons.
Perhaps Craig Mazin wanted to create drama for his series, or didn't use the right sources. However, in this case, it would have been respectful to change the names of the people involved, especially since some of them are still alive. Not only did the show misrepresent the main characters, but the series also shows that Craig Mazin didn't grasp the concept of the test that was taking place right before the accident. The series' main theory is that Dyatlov forced the test thinking he had some sort of fail-safe, the AZ5 button, he could press in order to shut down the reactor if things turned wrong. If this were true, it would be reckless behavior from Dyatlov and the operating staff, and it would be intolerable in any nuclear power plant. However, this is far from the truth. First of all, the AZ5 button is one of the reactor's shutdown buttons. It is used for both emergency situations and normal operations. Secondly, the AZ5 button, with or without accident, would have been pressed that night. Why? Because the reactor was scheduled to be shut down for maintenance on the night of the accident. On the other hand, they needed to perform a turbine test, which for safety reasons required shutting down the reactor. So what they did was to take advantage of the planned maintenance to perform the test beforehand. Thus, pressing the AZ5 button and shutting down the reactor was part of the turbine test. No matter what would have happened, they would have pressed the AZ5 button. In the series, a panicked Akimov presses the AZ5 button after a power surge. This is depicted as an emergency situation. However, in real life, after the test ended, Akimov ordered Toptunov to press the button as stipulated in the test program, and in a calm voice. This is confirmed by several eyewitnesses.
Having heard some kind of conversation, I turned and saw that reactor engineer Toptunov was speaking with Akimov. I was 10 meters away from them and did not hear what Toptunov said. Sasha Akimov ordered to shut down the reactor and gestured with his finger. Hit the button. Myself, I turned back to the safety panel, which I had been observing. There was nothing nervous in their behavior. It was a calm conversation and calm command. This is confirmed by Metlenko and Kuker of the electrical division, who had just entered the control room. With what voice did the NSB give the command to shut down the reactor?
Calm.
Did you hear vibration or noise before this?
No, everything was very calm.
There was no kind of pre-accident fuss. It was just the usual working fuss. Conversations all the time, discussions.
So not only did the staff respect the operating procedures, not only did Dyatlov not force his staff to complete the test, but there was absolutely no reason not to press the AZ5 button since it was part of the test and of any normal shutdown for maintenance. The idea that Dyatlov saw the AZ5 button as some sort of safety belt or fail-safe is simply false. There is no evidence for it, and it would be ridiculous for any nuclear operator, especially one as experienced as Dyatlov, to think he could do anything with a nuclear reactor without consequences just because he had a shutdown button. This idea can only come from people with poor understanding of the nuclear industry. To be fair, it also appears that Mazin doesn't understand the test. He seems to believe that it was some sort of nuclear test, when it was mainly an electrical one.
They all thought they had a failsafe.
Yes.
They had a big off button.
Correct.
It always works.
Always.
It's not a good thing to turn off your reactor, but you can do it if you need to.
Now, we do have, he made statements afterwards, lengthy statements, which I've read, which I find not credible. And in fact, the lack of credibility is indicative in and of itself.
Right.
That he still was kind of saying, no, this wasn't anything I did. I mean, yeah, we made some mistakes, but this was really because of, he chose to focus on the flaw without acknowledging that the flaw does not express itself unless you drive this nuclear reactor in the most bizarre and insane way.
Right.
So I think in his mind, he is being reckless. He wants to report a completed test. He knows the test, by the way, at this point is nonsense.
Yeah.
Right? It's not going to deliver any normal result, but he just wants to say he did it so that it could be signed off and done.
Ironically, the oscilloscope later shows that the electrical test was successful, despite the accident. There are other mistakes, such as the xenon poisoning that didn't happen. It would be too technical to explain them all. But what is to be remembered is that, in the series, the test was poorly understood and the behavior of operators totally misrepresented. If the operators were not to blame, who are the real culprits of the Chernobyl accident? First, we have to understand how an RBMK works and what were its design flaws. RBMKs were designed at the end of the 1960s by the Kurchatov Institute for Atomic Research, the Institute for Scientific Research and Design of Energy Technologies, NIKIET, and by the Sredmash, Ministry of Medium Mechanical Construction, headed respectively by Anatoly Alexandrov, Nikolai Dolezhal, and Efim Slavsky. The RBMK was a reactor both remarkable for its electrical power and colossal size, 20 times larger than Western reactors, but inexpensive to manufacture, since it did not require the use of enriched uranium or heavy water because they used graphite as a moderator instead. The lack of a containment enclosure also drastically reduced construction costs and would sadly prove fatal. The RBMK reactor had 4 major problems that were well shown in the HBO show. First, the positive void coefficient made the RBMK reactor sensitive to high temperatures, which would lead to a rise in power with a rise in temperature, unlike Western reactors, for which a rise in temperature decreases the reactor's power. Its colossal size also made the reactor difficult to pilot at critical times, forcing engineers in the control room to estimate activity levels using experience and intuition. Third, the lack of containment of the reactor. That means that radioactive materials could escape the nuclear power plant in case of an accident. Finally, if operators were faced with a situation calling for a shutdown, they could press the AZ5 button, which would cause all control rods to enter the core simultaneously by stopping the chain reaction. But the control rods were designed with a graphite tip ending, which could cause a momentary increase in reactivity if replacing water in the core. Scientific institutions knew at the time the flaws of the reactor. Especially the issue with the AZ5 button was known since there has been an incident in the Ignalina reactor in 1983 when a power peak had taken place after the AZ5 button was activated. In the series, Komyuk tells Legasov that he needs to tell the truth at the trial, since members of the scientific community, like the Kurchatov Institute for instance, would be part of the public and would be able to discover the flaws of the RBMK reactor and thus pressure the Soviet state to modify its nuclear reactors. This is actual nonsense. Those members of the scientific community designed the RBMK reactors, and thus were aware of its flaws and limits. This is demonstrated by the fact that several scientists of the Kurchatov Institute, for instance, campaigned to change the RBMK design before the Chernobyl accident.
Since 1965, staff members I.F. Jezerun, V.P. Volkov, and V.L. Ivanov have pointed out the nuclear danger of the proposed and subsequently implemented RBMK design at these very NPPs. Their actions were successfully blocked by academician A.P. Alexandrov and laid collecting dust. The launch and operation of the first unit of the Leningrad NPP in 1975 had in practice already confirmed the nuclear danger of RBMK reactors. If violations of regulations in the RBMK project prior to the launch of the first unit at LNPP can be considered errors, then the continued operation and subsequent replication following the experimental confirmation and operating experience of the first unit of LNPP can only be called a crime.
We found one Meister Yadrakinsky, a specialist at the Kursk nuclear power plant, who, as it turned out, had sent a warning letter to the State Committee for Nuclear Power Engineering Supervision a whole 6 months before the Chernobyl disaster. It indicated that RBMK-type reactors were unsafe. He also wrote that they had to be shut down so that the regulation and safety system could be redesigned. In reply, his conclusions were dismissed as groundless.
One scientist from the Kurchatov Institute warned that the design was too dangerous to be put into civilian operation. Another recognized that the hazards of the positive void coefficient made the new reactor inherently prone to explosion. And, although his superiors attempted to have him dismissed from the institute because of his dissent, he began a letter-writing campaign that eventually reached the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Soviet Council of Ministers.
VP Volkov passed the documents to the prosecutor's office as he was convinced, and quite correctly, that the explosion of the reactor occurred due to its inadequate quality and not at all through the fault of the personnel. And then the reaction of A.P. Alexandrov was instantaneous. Volkov was no longer allowed at the institute. 2 meetings of the Interdepartmental Science and Technology Council, chaired by A.P. Alexandrov, were held on June 2nd and 17, 1986. The president and thrice hero crushed everyone with the authority of power. As a result, all the causes of the accident were reduced exclusively to errors and incorrect actions by the personnel.
Thus, it is fair to say the ultimate cause of the Chernobyl accident was secrecy, assisted by its close companion, complacency. In the case of the RBMK reactor, doubts or criticisms about the safety of the reactor were suppressed to the extent that nuclear safety engineers working with the reactor did not understand its hazard potential. To illustrate the way in which criticisms were suppressed, consider the experience of Ivan Jezerun, senior scientist at the Kurchatov Institute. It was revealed in the Soviet press in July 1988 that Jezerun had written to numerous officials since 1965, pointing out the potential for an RBMK reactor to explode. He had accumulated more than 1,000 pages of correspondence with officials, and the only result had been that efforts were made to dismiss him from the Kurchatov Institute.
There is no doubt that knowing all of this up to the accident on April 26th, when it occurred, the academician clearly realized that the accident was a clear result of scientific and design miscalculations, and then to save his own reputation, who would judge him 3 times a hero and 8 orders of Lenin, actuated all levers to dump the blame solely on the personnel. This was not difficult for him to do, since the investigation was dominated by the Ministry of Media Machine Building, IAE and NIKIT, and such a conclusion poured balm on all of the hearts to the very top.
All those people, except for Volkov very briefly, were not mentioned once in the HBO show. Not a single line was given to talk about the RBMK designers or the scientists and managers at the Kurchatov Institute that designed an unsafe reactor and refused to modify it. Instead, Mazin spends hours blaming the operating staff and selling a ludicrous story taken from any 80s Reagan-era movie about how the KGB is trying to avoid modifying the reactor's safety. We have mentioned many historical figures of scientists who denounced the flaws of design in the RBMK reactor. It is, however, Legasov who steals the show as the character who reveals the truth about Chernobyl. But who was really Legasov? Valery Legasov was a Russian chemist born in 1936. A hardline communist at the time of the accident, he was the first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute and was friends with its director, Anatoly Alexandrov. It is important to note that Legasov was not a nuclear engineer. Despite not being a specialist, he was appointed to the government commission looking into the Chernobyl accident. In order to understand what role Legasov played during the handling of the accident, it is interesting to take a look at what his colleagues in the Soviet scientific community thought of him.
You know, the character of Legasov. He was not a physicist. He was a chemist. He researched into completely different things. Construction of reactors. He had an idea, but he researched into global safety.
Another senior scientist at the Kurchatov Institute and a colleague of his said that he was a clear representative of the scientific mafia, whose politicking instead of leadership in science led to the Chernobyl accident. And Dyatlov says the following about him.
V.A. Legasov's specialty was not in reactors, he didn't specifically know power plants, and I believe he couldn't have specifically figured it out anyway. By virtue of character, he trusted others. But this in no way justifies or explains his signature under the conclusion of the government commission and actions at the IAEA.
All the testimonies seem to agree with the idea that Legasov was a bureaucrat, well entrenched into the scientific establishment. This, of course, does not diminish his scientific accomplishments, but it's important to keep it in mind in order to understand his character and the reasons behind the choices he made. As a friend of Alexandrov, who was 83 years old at the time of the accident, and having an important position in the Kurchatov Institute, it's no secret that Legasov hopes to replace him in the near future as its new director. In case you are not convinced by the comments his colleagues made about him, Legasov himself confesses in his tapes his lack of expertise in nuclear engineering.
I was a member of the Science and Technology Council of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building of the USSR. But I was not a member of the reactor unit of this council, so I did not know many details or specific discussions. The traditional reactor engineering somehow did not interest me much. Well, it was not entrusted to me, and it seemed rather boring.
While this brief portrait of Legasov might not seem that much different from his portrayal in the series, which acknowledges his careerism, even going as far as to depict his anti-Semitism, there are indeed huge differences between HBO's Legasov and his real-life counterpart. Contrary to what the series pictures, Legasov was not one of the main scientists working on the cleaning of the accident. Legasov's main role was, in fact, to lie to the Western media and scientific community about the true causes of the disaster. Although the series did show that, the emphasis was also put on the three following points. 1. Legasov was forced to lie by the KGB in Vienna. 2. Legasov eventually fought for the truth in his tapes. 3. He did the right thing by exposing the reactor's flaws during the trial, thus sacrificing his career and eventually leading to his suicide. However, as we are going to see in detail, all of those events are false. 1. There is no proof whatsoever that Legasov was forced to lie in Vienna. He probably wouldn't have risked his career had he decided not to deliver his speech at the AIEA since he had friends in high places, and he certainly wouldn't have risked his life. Legasov was a high-ranking member of the Soviet scientific community and a respected communist. The idea that the KGB would have been after him at the time is just not believable. In fact, this was Legasov right after his speech in front of the international community, where he masterfully presented the Soviet version of events.
Pressed by reporters on the disadvantages in the reactor design he had mentioned, Legasov replied, "The defect of the system was that the designers did not foresee the awkward and silly actions by the operators." Nonetheless, he acknowledged that about half of the USSR's 14 remaining RBMK reactors had already been shut down for technical modification to increase their safety. Impressed by such apparently unprecedented candor from Soviet scientists, and reassured by the idea that the disaster was an extraordinary event that had little relevance for nuclear safety outside the USSR, and that its health and environmental consequences fell within acceptable limits, the delegates left the hall confident in the future of Soviet atomic energy and of their industry around the world. By the time they departed from Vienna at the end of the week, the mood was cheerful, almost jubilant. For the Soviet Union and for Valery Legasov personally, the conference was, a prominent British physicist remarked in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a public relations triumph. On his return to Moscow, Legasov went directly to the Kurchatov Institute and ran up the steps to the 3rd floor. "Victory!" he shouted to a friend.
This is not exactly the expected reaction of a man who was forced by the KGB or his oppressive government to lie to the Western scientific community. Legasov's lies were not limited to this speech, since he was also responsible for falsifying data in the report that was sent to the IAEA beforehand.
Halfway through the conference, during a coffee break amid 3 days of sessions closed to the media, the MIT physicist Richard Wilson had buttonholed 2 members of the Soviet delegation with a question that puzzled him. In the copy of the report that Wilson had obtained, rush-translated by the U.S. Department of Energy and dense with tables and statistics, the simple arithmetic in some places seemed wrong. The sum of figures plotting radioactive fallout in specific regions of the USSR didn't appear to match the total shown at the end. The 2 Soviet delegates had to admit that the numbers might not be quite right. Years afterward, Wilson learned that 6 pages of data on the contamination of Belarus and Russia had been excised from the report on Legasov's instructions.
2. Contrary to what the series shows, Legasov was not forced to lie in Vienna, and even more, he did not show a lot of remorse to do so, thus condemning 5 people to a work camp: Dyatlov, Fomin, Bruhanov, Rogozhin, and Kovalenko. Indeed, he tried to use the Chernobyl accident as a way to boost his career. His colleague Asmolov says the following:
First, we didn't think it was a heroic deed. When in the end of 1986 the government decided to award us, all Kurchatov Institute employees denied these awards, beside one man, beside Valery Alexeyevich Legasov. At the meeting of party activists of our institute, Anatoly Petrovich announced that the next day the newspaper Pravda would publish Valery Alexeyevich's photo with a star-shaped medal.
As a result of this work in Vienna, he became very popular. In Europe, he was named the Person of the Year. He entered the top 10 scientists in the world. This caused serious jealousy among his colleagues. In public, Legasov supported the official story that operator error caused the accident. In private, he campaigned for reactor safety and institutional reorganization. Perhaps in response to this, Legasov received criticism of his leadership and his handling of the containment of the Chernobyl reactor, and was ostracized by some of his fellow scientists.
Even in his tapes that Mazin presents as a truth bomb, Legasov still defends the actual culprit of the accident, the Kurchatov director Alexandrov.
Anatoly Petrovich had nothing to do with the design of the RBMK reactor at all, but I will tell you about the role of Anatoly Petrovich Alexandrov later, as objectively as I can. From my point of view, he bears some degree of guilt, of course, small, but he is too meritorious, has done too much for the country to talk about it in this way. What is the fault of Anatoly Pavlovich Alexandrov? The fault of Anatoly Pavlovich Alexandrov is that he, albeit reluctantly, consented. He was against it, objected to it together with the experts, but then went on to meet the stubborn requirements of State Planning Committee and the Ministry of Energy that stations can be built without containments. At first, he opposed it greatly. He fought, and I can prove this documentarily, but then he gave up. But under what conditions? Under the mandatory condition of the most rigorous compliance with all regulations and such. And for the last 20 years, he spoke wherever he could, at the Politburo, etc.
There is absolutely no proof about what Legasov is saying here. And as we have shown before, Alexandrov tried everything to hide his involvement in the Chernobyl accident. In any case, as the director of the Kurchatov Institute, he is responsible for the decisions made on the design that he finally reviewed. This defense by Legasov, who chastised the operators for their supposed mistakes, goes against his portrayal in the show. How is Legasov fighting the Soviet system and its lies, when even in his tapes he defends liars? 3. In the series, the trial episode is the culmination of Legasov's character arc, during which he redeems himself and becomes the hero who tells the truth about the RBMK design, and thus sacrifices his career. However, this did not happen. Legasov wasn't on the trial, and thus never had what the series presents as a redemption for our main character. To be fair, Mazin acknowledges this himself in the Chernobyl podcast. Then why include Legasov on the trial, especially since he was one of the people responsible for covering up the accident and defending the real culprits? It could be argued that it was a way to metaphorically show that Legasov told the truth through his tapes. However, as we've just seen, Legasov's tapes don't tell anything new about the accident, contain mistakes, and whitewash the true culprits of the accident. It seems that the only reason why Legasov was chosen as the hero of this story is because of his tragic fate and death, and certainly also because of a superficial research on Craig Mazin's part. As seen before, Mazin overly simplified the Chernobyl story to turn the reality into a sensationalistic TV series with its heroes and villains. However, it's not only the historical events that the series gets wrong, there are also major inaccuracies in how both nuclear power and the consequences of a nuclear accident are presented. For example, the series shows the digging of the tunnel below the reactor as an absolute necessity in order to avoid catastrophic radioactive fallbacks for all of Eastern Europe. However, the reality is different. Legasov himself says in his tapes that he didn't view this tunnel as a necessity, since the probability of the radioactive mass getting through the ground was extremely low. It was only a safety measure and not a matter of saving Europe of total destruction and contamination. This was also stated by Legasov in a meeting with Gorbachev.
For Belarusia and the Ukraine, impact means completely uninhabitable for a minimum of 100 years.
All in all, these measures were excessive. But at the time, it was understandable that they were preventative, just in case some mass got through by accident. This also had a considerable psychological effect on the population, demonstrating that measures were being taken to protect the groundwater. But from my point of view, why I wasn't an active supporter of this idea or even active opposer of it is because these jobs would require a lot of machinery to be concentrated in the zone.
In the series, Legasov is also shown completely distraught about the future consequences and the bad management of the accident. In reality, a few days after the explosion, he already thought that the consequences were going to be minimal and that there wasn't any real danger for the general population's health.
In response to this, I outlined the situation for him. That basically, as it was after the 2nd of May, the call was around the 4th or 5th of May, the radiation emissions from the destroyed block have ceased, and the situation is currently under control. The scale of contamination in the areas adjacent to the Chernobyl station, as well as the scale of contamination around the world, is more or less known to us. It was already clear to us that people injured by radiation, except for those who worked at the Chernobyl station at the time of the accident, are expected to be unlikely. That the control of the population is thorough. That if the countries that came under the nuclear fallout from the accident took proper informational and sanitary measures, then there will be no real consequences to the health of the people.
It's pretty clear that the reactions of the various characters involved in the aftermath of the accident are exaggerated, if not false. The same applies to the figures given in the end credits, where the number of people allegedly killed by the accident is grossly exaggerated. The WHO establishes that in total, no more than 4,000 people could die due to the Chernobyl accident. The death toll given by the series is dishonest because the range given, between 4,000 and 93,000 people, puts on the same level the figures given by the scientific community and by anti-nuclear militant groups like Greenpeace. The figures given by the WHO and the UNSCEAR are the results of years of research and investigation and are therefore more likely to be accurate.
Then when we think about other effects, actually there's no really good persuasive evidence of any public health impact due to radiation from the accident other than the thyroid cancers. Most people find that kind of hard to believe, but in fact that's the case.
Those same credits also mention a dramatic spike in cancer rates. While there was a rise in cancer rates in Ukraine and Belarus after the accident, it is demonstrated that it was mostly due to better screening in those countries. There is no correlation between cancer or leukemia rates and the Chernobyl disaster. Therefore, saying that the accident was followed by a dramatic increase in cancer rates is deceptive. The series amplifies the consequences of the accident, and to do so even resorts to catastrophic theories like the Bridge of Death one, which is an invention. This can be easily verified on Wikipedia. It's entirely possible that the writers of the show simply did not understand how radioactivity works, and affects human health. A good example of that is the depiction of the acute radiation syndrome, ARS, suffered by the firefighter character. We are going to show you a short excerpt of a famous video of a doctor who worked on the Chernobyl accident. We do not want to steal this work, we just want to show you an expert's take on this subject.
I don't think that this is realistic to have all this degree of burns and coloring and intensity all over the body. These look like someone really, a painter or artist was doing this without any solid knowledge or experience. It was ironic to me that next statement that came from Ulyana was, we need to tell the truth.
The problem with everything we have just covered is that the series seems to agree wholeheartedly with careless representations of radioactivity and equates figures from anti-nuclear associations with figures from international scientific reports. You'd imagine better from a series that claims to be a docudrama. After all this, we can ask ourselves one question. What is the goal of the Chernobyl TV series? Would it be to present the truth about the Chernobyl accident?
What do I want people to take away from Chernobyl? What I want them to take away more than anything is that if you lie, if you are part of a system of lying, if you are someone who agrees with lies, there is a cost attached to this. The truth is always there.
We showed that the story presented by Mazin is full of inaccuracies about the operator's role, the physics behind the accident, and radioactivity effects. Those mistakes could have been avoided had he interviewed the people involved in the accident, but he did not. Therefore, we cannot say the TV show presented the whole truth. So perhaps Craig Mazin only wanted to show what is the cost of lies in this type of accident. It also fails because the series promotes its own lies, keeping alive numerous myths about the Chernobyl accident, many of them promoted by the Soviet government or by anti-nuclear groups. So maybe Craig Mazin just wrote the show to honor the memory of the people that took part in the accident and its aftermath. But of course it also failed. The people in the operator room whose memory Mazin wanted to honor were dragged through the mud. Not only that, but they weren't even consulted for the series, which claims to be a docudrama. If Mazin wanted to tell his own story, it's fine. But why cling to historical accuracy when even the people involved tell you it didn't happen like that? We hope we made clear for you that this series achieved nothing it pretended to do and is just a sensationalistic show made by uneducated writers. We'd like to give the final word to Bruhanov's wife in an interview in which she reacts to the series. Thank you for listening, and we hope you have learned something today.
Дитина після довгих вмовлянь таки погодилась подивитися американський фільм «Чорнобиль», але лише фрагментами.
Но это не надо показывать. У нас не так будет. Зачем сквернить нашу память?